Hello and welcome to the recordproduction.com interview with Ken Scott. We're here
Yet another one.
Yeah, another one, yeah. We're here in Abbey Road, Ken's old stomping ground, and we're going to be talking mainly today about his new plug-in Epic Drums.
I don't know that I'd call it a plug-in, but
Sample library?
Yeah, sample library,
Best
kind of
way to
thing,
describe
yes.
it. So, do you want to give us a bit of a
history of it.
Yeah.
A few years ago, I was approached by a guy that had made a lot of money doing samples, and he had a company called East West. His name was Doug Rogers. He had always been a Beatles fan, so he came up with this idea of putting together, remaking Beatles sounds as closely as possible for the sample market. And he bought an old red desk, an old EMI red desk. He bought an old EMI TG desk. He bought Altec compressors, modified the way EMI did. He bought all of the gear he possibly could that would have been used back then. He then went and bought one of the top studios in LA called Cello, which is now called East West. And then he approached me, and yeah, I'd love to give it a try. I'd never been part of something like that before. And we went in with Lawrence Juba and, hell, I can't remember the drummer's name. He used to be with Wings. Then, yeah, no, it won't come. I'll think of it later. Don't worry, I'll be back on that one. We emulated Beatles sounds, and I had a lot of fun doing that, and so wanted to take it further. So one of the things that I seem to be most known for is my drum sounds. So I decided to contact 5 of the drummers that I'd used to work with in the past, successfully, hopefully, and recreate the sounds that we got back then using the same gear. Everything was recorded through Trident A-Range boards, matched up the studios as closely as possible to the audio environments that we recorded them in originally. Same mics, we got same drum kits, or as close as possible with some of them. And I had them play along with the original records. We matched the sounds. I then had them play along with the records to get grooves. Then we got the single samples and then just had them jam so that we had extra grooves as well. And that's called Epic Drums.
And it is epic, isn't it? There's,
Yes.
According to the stats I've got written down here, because
Oh, no.
I knew I wouldn't remember these, 116 gig
Yes.
of samples. That's 3,868 grooves, 175,959 samples, 7 kits,
Bloody
1
hell.
percussion, and it's all at 24.48, isn't it?
Yes.
I think 24.96 would have been.
Well, we did record it 96, but
so-
we decided
right.
people
Must have
didn't
been-
want to spend weeks loading one
Yeah.
program in.
And,
yeah.
and it runs through Contact Player.
Yes.
For any of the
That's the
and that's
plug-in
free
side.
as well, isn't it?
Yes.
So there's no added cost there to actually run it. But, so what drove your decision-making process as to who to include and which era to replicate?
One of the things for me, first and foremost, having spent a lot of times, I think every engineer stroke producer has done these days, spending an enormous amount of time going through listening to snare drum sounds. Big snare, small snare, large snare with room, small, trying to find a sound. I thought what I wanted to do was get very sort of album-oriented sounds. So as close to all of the Ziggy sounds as possible. So I used Woody Woodmansey. There was a band that I managed and produced in the States called Missing Persons. The drum was Terry Bozzio. So we matched up to that as closely as possible. Mahavishnu Orchestra with Billy Cobham, Dixie Dregs with Rod Morgenstein, and Supertramp with Bob Siebenberg. And what I wanted was I wanted different drum sounds. Each of them have totally different sounds. And for the grooves, I wanted totally different feels, which all 5 are totally different style drummers. And from that element, it certainly worked.
Can we go through those in a little bit more detail then? Which sessions were recorded where and so on?
for Epic Drums.
Yeah.
We started off with Bob, the Supertramp, doing that at New Monkey in Van Nuys, California. Then we did Bill Cobham. It's Longview Farm, which is just outside of Boston, the east coast of US. And then the other three were all recorded at, I can't remember the name of the studio. It used to be American Recorders. And what it's called now, Emblem, that's it, Emblem Recorders, which is it's in California, Los Angeles.
Right. And you'd recorded these guys mainly over here, haven't you?
Well, no, let's see.
You did Billy at Trident, didn't you?
Well, I did some at Trident, but then did some at Atlantic, some at Electric Lady originally. So Bill was all over the place. Woody was all at Trident. Bob was at Trident, and then for the second album it was at A&M Studio D. Rod Morgenstein, Dixie Dregs was all Chateau Recorders in LA, and Bozio was Chateau Recorders in LA.
Right.
And Zappa's studio.
Yeah. So it's a challenge to track down identical gear then?
Everything was a challenge with that. It's tracking down every Trident A range. Luckily there were only, I think it was 13 made, so that made it easier, but they seem to have changed hands so frequently. That then finding that the recording environment for each person, but it got close.
And do you feel the gear still performs in the same way as it did 20 years ago, 30 years ago?
Mostly, yeah.
Right.
Mostly. Okay. I think one of the big differences, and we were originally going to also record analog, so that the user had the choice between analog and digital, still through contact, so it would all be digital eventually. But we started doing that with Bob, but then we found having to stop and every 15 minutes and all of that kind of thing, it was just too time consuming, so we gave up. But in the follow-up to Epic Drums, which we'll discuss in a bit, Epic Drums EDU, the user in that actually has the opportunity of comparing, at least for Bob, between analog and digital. We put in both versions of the groove that's there for people to work with. And the difference is amazing. Just looking at the waveform, it's different. If you're into just looking at things, the sound is totally different. And that, I think, is the biggest difference between what we've put out and what the original actually was. There isn't that tape compression.
I liked on the it's Sonic Reality website the term top-notch studio, bringing a bit of top-notch studio to the...
I had nothing to do with that. So.
I think that's very British, and that kind of... Do you feel that what sort of demographic are you going? What's your target audience for the...
Anyone that uses samples, anyone that might want to use the grooves. The grooves are probably more for writers, maybe scoring movies, that type of thing. Because if you've got a band or something like that, you've already got the drummer, so you really don't need them doing the grooves. And you're just putting together an arrangement so that they can learn from it. Samples is just anyone that uses samples, and it's that thing. You know what we want? We want the typical English Brit sound from the early 70s. Oh, I've got that here, Ziggy, right, pull it right up, and just, or the more open Supertramp sound. Yeah. You can pick it out easily.
Where do you see the place of these then, in terms of maybe a reaction against the sort of hyper-compressed modern drum sounds? Because I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your attitudes towards the modern drum sound, whatever that is.
Whatever that is, because it has nothing to do with the person recording it. It's whoever's mixing it that seems to be in control of that these days. But we'll save that conversation for a little bit later. No, it's just whoever... I still like to work with real musicians. So I tend to not use samples very much. but I know there are a lot of people that do use samples. A lot of students, the only work that they do within their courses is more sample oriented than live drummers, which is the reason for EDU, because it gives them the opportunity to try mixing a live drum kit, which they're probably not used to doing.
So should we go through EDU now?
Sure.
Then?
Having recorded these 5 incredible drummers, all multi-track, every mic on its own, it just struck me one day that there are a lot of students that have never worked with a live drum kit, and one day, if the recording business is as cyclic in the future as it's been in the past, real drums are going to come back in, and suddenly they're going to be completely lost, because having never worked with real drums before, what do? There are a lot of inherent problems. So I thought it might be great for them to get 3.5 to 4 minute grooves from these drummers, all mics completely on their own, and they, within their own home, within the studio, at the college, whatever, they can actually practice mixing live drums, learning the problems. I've put in with this how just some mixes that I did, and they can watch it on Pro Tools, or I think it's another 5 different doors it's all set up for. So they get to learn the problems, so that one day when they do hopefully when they get a real drum kit in front of them, they'll know what to do.
With the Epic Drums EDU, as an educational thing, I guess you're focusing on making students aware of the amount of spillage that's normal and so on.
Absolutely, and how you deal with it. I use gates. Keypexes were the best for me, but then Drawmers took over. But these days you don't have to do that. You have seconds that will go through, and they'll just eradicate everything whenever a tom's not being hit. But it just, if they look at the way I've done a mix, they'll see all this kind of thing. And you don't always necessarily completely cut out all of the spillage. You've got other things going on. You just bring it down a bit. Just that cymbals do leak into toms, and all of the kinds of problems that you run into, the squeaks, the distortion every now and again. And
I guess that's what records sound like and should sound like.
In my humble opinion, absolutely.
You use like diaphragm condensers, don't you, on toms and things like that? What is that? Just what was done at Abbey Road when you started?
No, certainly not when I started. It was more D19s. A lot of D19s. I just by the time I moved to Trident, I think I was using the condensers, and I've never moved from there when possible. Yeah.
Do you think that's brings a more open sound to the drums, or?
You know, for me, it's just what I'm used to. I'm a creature of habit, I've come to learn, and miking is always the same. The EQ I use is always the same, and the different sounds that come out come from the instrument themselves. I think it's very important to push that to get a great sound in the control room, you've got to have a good sound in the studio to start with. That's where it all comes from, be it the player, be it the drums, or whatever equipment you're using. It all starts there, and we as the engineer producer are there to enhance that. We're not going to, it doesn't matter how many plugins we have, we're not going to make a great sound if it's not there to start with.
So you said that miking is always the same. What can we have a brief rundown of your?
Well, actually, in EDU, there's also DVDs. Apart from just the multi-tracks, there's a DVD that I go through everything that I do. The EQ I use, the mics I use, all of that. So, but basically, it's an RE20 on bass drum these days. It's 87s, Neumann U87s on toms, KM84 snare, and Cole 4038s overheads.
What type of overhead positioning are we talking?
Generally, it's spread out. I don't do the
Yeah.
centre
Yeah.
aiming out. I put them on either side and just aim it to get the best of what's there.
Right, excellent. In terms of preparing the kit then, what sort of processes do you go through in terms of tuning? How do you like to approach that?
I tend to not get too involved in that these days. I did early on. A classic example was for Crime in the Century. I think we spent a day and a half just getting the drum sound, and yeah, especially these days with the budgets that are around, you can't do that kind of thing. So if it's not an established drummer that knows what he's doing, there's a guy in LA, the drum doctor, that we call in to do that kind of thing. So that's always taken care of.
Before the
yes.
Before the drummer
if need be.
Room.
Hopefully the drummer knows enough to be able to do it.
Well, I guess
anyway.
you're working with people of a calibre who
Most
know what
of the
they're
time,
doing.
luckily.
Is there any advice for a young student, for instance, who's doing their first drum recording? What would be your sort of your key point?
It's not just for drum recording. It's for everything. There are three things. The most important thing in the studio is always the monitors. If the monitors aren't good, you don't know what you're listening to. So what's the point? If you don't know what you're listening to, it's going to sound like there's every possibility it will sound like crap once you get it out. So why even bother? Make decisions. It's don't put everything off till the mix or I started off on 4-track, and we would record bass, drums, guitars all together on one track. We had to make the decision up front what we were going for and go through with that. And there is nothing dangerous about making decisions. No one's going to die in the job that we're doing. So the drum sound doesn't quite fit what the overall thing is. It's sometimes that can actually work out better. So it's just make decisions and go with those.
Yeah, I mean you've had some pretty distinctive drum sounds over your career, working with all sorts of people from David Bowie to Level 42 and so on. Are there any that particularly say this is the Ken Scott sound?
Absolutely not as far as I know anyway. Other people have said that I have a distinctive sound. I have no idea. I get bored easily, so I've changed the style of music I've worked on across the board throughout. And although what I go for, I've always gone for sort of a certain depth there and make sure everything's heard, but it doesn't always have to be heard the first time you listen to it. If the 100th time, wow, there's that guitar playing that part, I've never noticed that before. I want that kind of thing, and I've always wanted 5.1 before there was 5.1, using reverb and things like that and room to get a depth to it. So that's been the same with every act I've worked with, but other than the finished product, to me, is always different. So I don't know what my sound is.
Yeah. Would you say it was limited by, or steered by the gear that you're using, I suppose?
To a point, but then I've been lucky because at least finally for the mix stage, I've always had final say on where that's going to be and what the equipment's going to be. So, although obviously in the early days you take something like Crime or any of the Bowie records, we only had for reverb we had one plate. And so there was no, we'll have a short reverb on this, we'll have a long one there, we'll have a trebly one there. We just had the one, so we had to, once again, it comes down to making the decision what it's going to be. And you work around and you get it to sound the way you want it.
In terms of the microphones you use for drums, how important are they individually?
I'm a creature of habit. I tend to stick with the same ones all the time because I know ultimately what they will sound like. But there was a classic example for me that showed really it doesn't mean anything. There was a band that was brought to me, an American band called Missing Persons. They were brought to me by Frank Zappa and his wife, and they consisted, three of the members had played with Zappa at one point or another. Now, when we were first starting, we were just going to be doing demos, and Frank had just had this brand new studio built in his home, and he offered it to us to do the demos. And the reason he did that was he wanted to come back off the road and immediately start recording, and he knew my reputation for finding every single solitary fault that there is in a studio, really pissing off the maintenance guys, and he knew that if I went in there I'd find everything, so he could start straight off. Well, Frank used to record every single one of his shows for possible use in future albums, so he had all of his best mics out on the road with him. So we were left with whatever there was left, and it wasn't a very good selection. But finally, we got the sound, we recorded it, finished off the album late. These were also used on the album later, which I did in the studio that I was using all the time at that point, using my regular mics, and you can't tell the difference. So basically, my choice in what that does come down to, though, it does really show very well, is the importance of monitors, because Frank's monitors were good, and I would have EQ'd so that they sounded, even though they're different mics, I would have EQ'd so they sounded the same way on there, and they still matched up later with ones in another place.
So you're still EQing on the way in?
Oh,
in terms of working digital?
Oh, yes. Absolutely. Make decisions. How can you... There's nothing worse than having to set everything up every bloody time to try and get it to sound like the mix. It's... Now, I want it to sound like the mix all the way along the line. And you add something and you have to change it slightly. But for the musicians, the artists, and as the producer, you want to hear the finished thing as much as possible.
I suppose sort of home recording and low budget systems go against that grain in that way, in terms of not really letting you bounce things down together. And
you can always bounce things down together.
Yeah,
when recording, you're not necessarily recording everything at one time.
Obviously, if you've got a desk, then that's fine.
Yeah, but then in the studio, I still don't. I still tend to do things one at a time quite often anyway. So that's the same thing. I suppose the one thing for not EQing on the way in is if you're recording at home and you're not sure of the monitors, and then you're going to mix it somewhere that have good monitors, it might be safer to leave it un-EQ'd, but
useful. Yeah.
You should get good monitors at home in the first place. So.
That's good tip. Yeah.
Now I'm hard that way because I like them loud. I don't like near field monitors. So for me, that working with near field monitors is very hard. I like them loud and booming, and I have to feel it these days. It's not a question of I'm going deaf. Yeah. Though my wife would disagree. It's more I just need to feel the music.
We were talking about dynamics before, weren't we? Of modern music.
There aren't any.
Well, yeah, that's what I was going, because obviously from you know the stuff you were doing here and the Bowie era and so on, and your Trident work, you know, dynamics presumably wasn't much of a question at that point.
That's what music is all about. It has to get louder and softer and move you, and if it's just constant, it's going to bore you before it's ever going to move you. And the thing that fascinates me is that with modern technology, we now don't have to worry about signal to noise or anything like that. We have the ability to have far greater dynamics, and we've lost them completely. Yeah, it's nonsensical to me.
You got 120 dB headroom on CD, and
I actually went through a situation recently. I feel so strongly about it. I did a project up in Seattle and then back down to LA to mix it, and I assumed that the people that had hired me to do it did it because of my past work, so that's the way I did it. It had dynamics, it had all that kind of thing. And what do? They give it to a mastering engineer that just boom, it's like that. And I said, sorry, I'm having my name taken off the record. Yeah. And said, no, you can't do that. We need your name. I'm sorry. They do it the way I want it. And no, it's got to be like that. Fine.
Yeah.
That's not me. That's not my work. It's I don't want my name on it.
People can always turn their volume up, can't they? On the
Yeah,
stereo?
for a period of time, we were doing two mixes. We were doing the ones that people buy, and then there was the radio mix, which was more compressed. Because when it goes on the radio, it's automatically going to get compressed anyway. It's fine, do it that way. For MP3s, then if you need it, have them compressed so that people walking around with traffic all around them, their earbuds in, they won't hear the traffic, but the traffic won't affect what they're listening to. But also have it available in a decent format. That it does have dynamics.
With this proliferation of digital recording and lower budget studios, that there is a tendency for people to go into the studio before they're ready.
Oh, probably. I look at the modern technology twofold. It's on one hand, it's giving people that wouldn't have had a chance to do things for them to make great things, and it's giving people that wouldn't have had the chance to do things that they shouldn't do. Everything human can always go in two directions, the yin and the yang, all of that. And people being able to use the technology at home is amazing. It's incredible. But it does bring people doing things sooner than they should. People should be out, musicians should be out playing live gigs, learning their trade that way, finding out what works with the public. They shouldn't be, back in the day, and I hate to keep on using that phrase, but it seems to cover when I'm talking about, it was all about making music. It wasn't jumping on the most recent bandwagon and going specifically for a record deal and to become famous. It's completely changed these days, thanks to the majors and all of the money that they would give some artists and all of that kind of thing. That suddenly took over. With the death of the majors as it's going, I think people will have to start playing out more live, and they'll be able to do what they want to do. There'll be less jumping on bandwagons. They will learn their trade, which is playing music. As far as engineers go, I think it's going to be a similar kind of thing. I personally feel that every engineer, every trainee engineer should spend, and force themselves if they have to spend 3 to 6 months doing nothing but 4-track recording. They can still do it Pro Tools, but limit themselves to only using 4, maybe 8 at a crunch, but so that they learn about mixing things together at once and making decisions. That's just me.
It was a lot easier, wasn't it, really?
Was it?
Than dealing with, well, I kind of grew up on 4 and then 16 tracks.
Yeah.
But I found it easier to say that's the cut-off point. I think.
Oh yeah, yes. There is that kind of thing of knowing you can only do so much. It's like the old class system over here. The servants below stairs knew they could only get up so far, so they never tried to go any further. And whilst the people up there could only go so, but when you only got 16, you can only go so far. When you've got 199, you're going to go to 199. People have to learn themselves to limit themselves, make the decisions. I can't say that enough. And yes, as soon as you start to make decisions, it becomes easier. It's the more things you put off, the harder it is later on down the line to make a decision. So yes, in that respect, 4, 8, and 16, 24 were easier.
In terms of having stuff mastered, do you, pre-mastering really, isn't it? Do you use the same people, or how much influence do you have in that? The choice of engineer?
Obviously, from that last project, the way they sent it to someone, I didn't like what they did.
Yeah.
I don't have much control over that these days. I used to. These days, not really. My whole thing with most mastering engineers these days is they don't know what the hell they're doing. I started off here at Abbey Road in the tape library, then as a second engineer, and before I was allowed to become an engineer sitting behind a board, I had to learn mastering. And it always went the same way. For the first 3 days, we started off doing playback acetates. For anyone that doesn't know what playback acetates are, it was what we had to do. There were no CDRs, there were no cassettes or anything like that. It was the way the artist, the producer, got to hear what they'd worked on at home. Just small 7-inch, to last about 10 plays. So we would start off cutting playback acetates, and when you're first left alone for maybe 3 days, you put a tape on. Oh, that tape needs a little more high end. Boom, you turn it full bore. Yeah, that's better. Now, maybe a bit low end. Boom, full bore, low end. Getting there. Now just some mids, and you turn it full bore. And it took 3 days before you realised that the tape just needed 1 notch at 10, perfect. To me, the mastering engineers of today have never gotten through that 3 days. It's the person that knows what the record is supposed to sound like is the producer and the engineer. They're the ones that had the vision in the first place, and it should be as close to what they give as possible. That's my whole philosophy with regard to mastering. It shouldn't be suddenly slammed through compressors, all of that crap that they use. They certainly shouldn't be given stems so they can rebalance the entire bloody thing. No, it's the producer and the engineer should know what's going on.
And you're far from alone as a producer in that view.
Oh, sure.
I wonder why it's still the case that that's so common. Very sad, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
It comes down to the majors. That the majors being taken over by people that aren't musically oriented. They're as prone to jump on fads as anything. The whole thing of having to use auto-tune all the time, because as far as it has to be in tune as far as they're concerned. They don't even know most of them don't even know what auto-tune is or anything, but if it hasn't gone through it, then it can't be good. With Bowie, it was first takes on 95% of the stuff, and no, there are times it's not quite in tune, but it works. They're performances. That's what it's supposed to be about. It doesn't have to be perfect. That makes it human.